Hey, thanks for coming, first of all. Nice to see everybody here. In the middle of your workday, interesting situation. Interesting place to work here, I have to say, just walking around. It's kind of amazing to me. Before I talk about this book or anything else, and once I get done talking about it and we do the Q&A, you don't have to ask about the book. You can if you want. You can ask about anything, whatever you feel like talking about. But I actually might have more questions for you, possibly. Okay, so, before you come here, they give you this consent form I got to sign, right? And it's totally fine. You can see, I've signed it. I have no problem signing this. Anytime you're being videotaped and it's going to be like on the internet, you've got to sign these things. This is a very interesting one, though. One, it says they can use anything, and they have all these index, host, route. They use all these words that I kind of vaguely associate with technology. But then the most interesting one to me is that I also waive any moral rights that I might have to my name or likeness. I thought this was a fascinating, I waive them, go ahead. It's going to be weird if you use this for a fucking ISIS recruiting video or something. I don't know how this would happen, why I would lose the moral right. I'm not even sure how I would demand it. It was like, morally. But then I started thinking about something else as I was signing this thing. And I was talking backstage before, and she mentioned, Hillary Clinton gave one of these, and Katie Couric, I guess, did one of these, big time people. And I was like, I've never seen one of these, though. Why have I never seen one of these? It's famous people talking in public at Google. So it would seem as though if something wanted to be made to go viral, you would have the tools to make that happen. But then I thought to myself, what if I did see one, and I knew it came from a Google lunch? Would I then be skeptical that I'm seeing it because it happened at Google? I started thinking about this. We were talking, and again backstage, about how, people have this sort of fear of institutions. Many things in people's lives, which they love, maybe if they're not even conscious of it or directly say so, are really probably an extension of the work you're doing here. And yet if someone said, what do you think of Google? It's a weird thing to be like, I love it. It's a weird thing to love because it seems as if it's almost like an umbrella over the entire culture. So, and then I thought to myself, I'm talking to the people working here, though, okay? So the people working here, how do they view what they're doing? Do you view what you're doing sort of like the way somebody would view their work at NASA in 1965? That you're essentially building the future, that you are creating what the world is going to be like. Whatever small role you're playing is integral to the lives of almost everybody who's going to exist from here on out. Or I was like, do they view it more like working in the corporate structure of something like McDonald's? That they know it's culturally important, but it's just a job. They work this job and this thing. The product itself is almost secondary to how the work is and how the experience is to your life. So this prompted me to want to do a small test, okay? I want to do this, okay? And I said this before, and the camera's on me. The camera's not on you. So no one's going to see you, okay? And this is going to seem a little hokey. When I tell you to close your eyes, I want everyone to close their eyes. Now, granted, you're like, well, I'm going to peek, I'm going to cheat. Well, you can do that. It'll ruin everything, though. If you do this one thing, I'm going to have you close your eyes, and I'm going to ask you a question. And I want you to raise your hand if you think the answer to this question is true. And if you think it's false, don't raise your hand. Okay, so close your eyes. Is Google potentially too powerful? Okay. That's interesting to me. You're wondering how many people said yes? I'd say a little over a third, okay? And to me, the curious part of this is that I included the word potentially. So that means 2/3 of you see that there's no way Google could be dangerous. And in another way, I guess that makes me a little confident that you actually feel like we're all altruistic here. There is not even a potential of something. I don't even know what the bad thing I'm picturing could happen. We were talking about how this is like a great place to work. It just looks awesome. You have this awesome cafeteria, and you can sit anywhere you want, and all the chairs look nice, and everybody here looks pretty chill and cool. It seems almost like I've never worked at any place like this ever. Nope, this seems better than any. It seems better than every place I've ever worked, to be honest. But yet, the way you would describe this to someone is like how you describe the beginning of the dystopic novel. This is like it's like, oh, you never have to leave, and everybody just kind of lives and integrates their life with the. It's like, it's like that seems awful, and yet I'm seeing it, and I'm like, this seems fucking great, and I don't know what the answer is. I think you're just in a. You don't. And maybe I'll say this, and you'll be like, of course I'm not, but like, don't underestimate how interesting your life is. Like, you're part of something that is, I think, when you're an old person and you're talking to a young person, they are going to be shocked that you had this job. Okay, because I don't know why. It might be because like we're living in caves or something, but it probably won't be. It'll be like we're living in it'll just be like, you were doing that, It's like, you're all living great lives. Okay. Okay, as for this book is called What If We're Wrong? Essentially what it is an attempt to do is it's to think about the present tense as if it were history, okay? Because, we tend to think about history very differently than the way we think about the way the world is happening in front of us. This is in all aspects. There's like parts of this book on science, but also like parts on culture. And saying what's the difference? Well, say there's like a new Drake video that goes online or something, People are looking at it and they're basically saying, is this entertaining? How does it sort of compare with the rest of Drake's catalog, okay? How is it in step with like the identity politics of the day or whatever? Very kind of close to the, but we don't think that way about, say, music clips we see from 1962 or 1963. If we see some, pre-Beatles clip of an artist, we're thinking about like, well, what are they doing that is still being done today? And how far advanced were they at the time? And what did this mean? And we're trying to, we think about culture from that period in a certain way. How does it fit into that? So what I was trying to do is like, well, let me try to kind of jump into the mind of this non-existent person, this person who is yet to be born, who in maybe 150 or 300 or 1,000 years, if mankind lives that long, is looking back at this period. What are the things that they'll be interested in? Sort of the arbitrary nature of how history is built. Just using music again as an example, like one thing I talk about in this book is I sort of feel like John Philip Sousa is the most successful American musician who ever lived. And my argument for that is this. We all know what marching music is. If they played marching music over the sound system now, you'd be like, oh, it's 4th of July, or it's like a college football game or whatever. Someone's making a documentary about the past, and they're trying to tell us this is when it happened. We all know what marching music is. And yet, if we went on the street and we asked people, like, name someone who made marching music, there would be one of two answers. They'd either be like, I don't know, no one. Or they would say, John Philip Sousa. He's shorthand for marching music. He has become synonymous with the genre itself. They are completely integrated. There is no separation between the two. He is the idea, okay? I think this will happen, say, with Bob Marley. I can very easily imagine a time where in 200 years, maybe even less, maybe in my own lifetime, when the worldwide understanding of reggae music is the same or even less than the recognition of the figure of Bob Marley. So I try to deduce what rock musician will play that role if there is a point when rock music essentially disappears and becomes an academic pursuit. So now in the future, it's some classroom, and there's a guy lecturing about musicology, and he's talking about all these different forms of music, and he's talking about how there was this genre of music called rock and roll that existed in the last half of the 20th century and the very beginning of the 21st, and it was probably had the biggest shaping influence on youth culture outside of television than anything else. And he's going to then, and they'll have no idea about it. They'll be like, they'll kind of know what it sounds like in a vague sense. They probably can't recognize one song. And he will use some artist, the way we use John Philip Sousa with marching music. And he'll be like, this is what it was. And like I read a chapter in this book trying to figure out who that person might be. There's also a section, like a large section in this book on science, where I talk to like different physicists. I'm not a scientist myself, but I talk about the idea of, I'm not really attacking any specific principle in science because I'm not informed enough to do that. I talk about sort of science in totality. Like, what is the likelihood that the way we are pursuing science will one day seem antiquated, the same way it did in, say, the way, the 1500s, like everything that we view about science and the scientific method and all that stuff kind of comes from Newton in the 1600s and the Copernican revolution and all these things, But like an example I use early in the book is just like discussing gravity itself. In fact, what I was doing is I talked to this physicist, Brian Greene from Columbia. He's kind of like a rock star physicist. He was on the Big Bang Theory and everything. I guess it's as famous as you can be if you're like a theoretical physicist. But so I'm talking to the guy, and I'm basically just trying to tell me, like, get his sense if he has any fear of like the things that he is engulfed in, string theory, the multiverse, all of these things. If one day that this will just seem totally absurd, okay? And in order to make him think that like I wasn't insane, I tried to always be conservative, and I was like, I know some things are like off the table, like it's like our understanding of gravity is stable. And he was like, no, it's not. In 500 years, I think we'll think about gravity totally different. So then I thought to myself, well, okay, this book will work. If the thing I'm using as the unchangeable kind of control is changeable, everything is available. And it is, but it's true. It's like, okay, for the longest time, the belief about what gravity was based on Aristotle. This was back, when, science was more connected to philosophy than math. So Aristotle, who was just this guy who was brilliant, sat around thinking of stuff. People were like, it must be true. His idea about gravity was, and so I'm sure a lot of you know this, it's like, well, a rock doesn't float because a rock wants to be on the ground. A rock has agency. It desires to be at the center of the universe. The center of the universe must be the center of the earth because earth is in the center of the universe. So the reason a rock is going to the ground is because it wants to be there. If there wasn't ground, it would just keep on going. And everyone kind of hears that and it's like, well, haha, cute. Or whatever, People thought that for like 2,000 years. That was sort of like what they thought was like the best example, like this is a real reasonable way to sort of think about gravity. So our understanding of gravity now starts with the 1600s. It hasn't been that long, What is the likelihood that this time we are right? Part of me says, well, we do science differently now. Now we tie it in with math. So now we've gotten to the point where we're just kind of sharpening the spear. We don't understand it completely, but we're getting closer. Another part of me is like, every generation thinks this. Every generation has believed that they are pretty close to viewing reality the way reality actually is. And thus far, they have all been wrong. Now, does that mean we will be wrong? Could we be the one group who finally kind of gets to the end of a lot of these questions about what makes something valuable or what makes something interesting or true? It's possible. It is possible that this could be the case. Artificial intelligence could play a role in this, But then that brings up a whole different set of questions. What does it mean to be an intellectually curious person if all the big questions have been answered? That sort of is I'm guessing for a lot of people in this room, your whole life has been built around being like, why does that work? Why is that? I want to know about this. I want to figure this out. Why can't we do this yet? Well, when those questions end, imagine the young version of you with none of those questions. What would you have done? What would you have pursued? You'd still be smart. You would have still had the skills that you have now, but you would have directed them in a totally different way. So that's kind of what this book is about. It's a weird description. I talk about politics in this book, about like, what if, right now we sort of assume, kind of reflexively, that there is no better system than democracy. That anything that's democratic is better than any other option. People didn't always think this. We kind of came to this conclusion later. We could be very wrong about this. The thing that might sort of destroy this country And destroy, I'm kind of using not like a meteor destroy, I mean just change what it means to be an American. It could be the things that we currently see as strengths, like the Constitution. Like right now, it's pretty hard to be against the Constitution. You could not run for city alderman saying, I hate the Constitution. You would lose your local race, okay? You certainly couldn't run anything above city alderman being against the Constitution. It's like we just kind of accept that this is sort of the fabric of what sort of makes this right. But you know, imagine that you're reading a textbook about a distant society, a society from hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of years ago. And the thing it says is that like, this society created a document and decided that this document was what they were going to use forever, inflexibly, even though everything changed about that society. Everything. But they're still sticking to this. And in fact, it's going to be so hard to change this document that like, at one point, someone will be like, hey, we should put something in there about equal rights. And people will be like, no, don't change it. It's like too dangerous. You know, it's like, that's what it may look like to people in a distant future when they look back at America. They may have been like, boy, this, you know, they started this country with 13 colonies where the biggest difference between being in the South and being in the North was how thick your coat was. That was sort of the biggest difference, you know. It's like, but now how much, how similar is your life to someone living in rural Alabama or suburban Boise or even like Northern California? Okay, like your life is completely different. The relationship you have with these people are probably it's probably greater than the distance between your life maybe and someone living in London, very possibly. And yet the Constitution is supposed to apply the same to all people over time. This is a good idea, a strength that eventually becomes a weakness. These are the kind of things I think about in this book. Now we're going to go to like the Q&A or the cocking part, whatever part we're going to go to. But I appreciate you listening to me. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll be very interested to see what you're interested in. Okay.
Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to ask a few questions.
Okay,
we're going to open it up for Q&A. So, I think since we're at Google, I think it's interesting to think about how will Google and Microsoft and Amazon all be sort of looked at in the future, right? How do you look at these big tech companies? One of the topics you talk about in the book is that the internet has sort of been a place where we can create consensus, but it's also a place where one person can disrupt the status quo. So does the internet ultimately help us be right, or does it continue our sense of being wrong?
Well, I mean, I guess that is the core question about the internet. Okay, what's the dream of the internet? The dream of the internet is that it is going to sort of diversify thought. That now many people will be able to sort of put ideas into the cultural bloodstream. There will be no obstacles or limits. You don't need to work at a newspaper or own a newspaper in order to sort of have some kind of control of the discourse, and that it will sort of widen the number of opinions there are. And yet my fear is that the opposite is happening. That what is happening is that though, yes, there is that potential, everybody could have any idea they want and put it into the public, for the most part, the same ideas are being forwarded, retweeted in some cases or whatever, shared. That it's the same ideas in different versions that are being put out in a mass amount that will almost calcify those ideas. Here's an example. Say we found a novel from the late 1700s, and it was kind of popular at the time. But we decided that this novel was very interesting, so we would read it, and we would reinterpret what it would mean. And we would go back and try to research, this novel. Maybe a few people reviewed it. We might have a few scant details about the writer's life. But for the most part, it would be open for us to sort of reinvent the meaning, okay? Would that be possible in the future with someone like Jonathan Franzen or Zadie Smith? Or would people go back and see just this avalanche of information about what the book Freedom meant and what the book White Teeth meant and how the people perceived Franzen and how people perceived Smith, and that maybe there'd be interviews with both of them where they'd talk about how they are perceived and what this means? I think it would make it very difficult then to reinvent that meaning, okay? So in some ways, the internet might do maybe the opposite of what this book discusses has happened over time. Over time, in the past at least, here's what seems to have happened. The people who experienced like a period or an era seem to be the only ones who are completely unqualified to say what it meant. That like even though they lived through it and they had all the experiences, it's the people who come after them and recontextualize what it all meant, and that becomes what history is. So it is possible that the internet is allowing us maybe to control our own history a little bit more, simply by volume. That people who are alive can say, no, this is how it feels, this is how it feels, this is how it feels, and this is what it was, and this is what's going on. And maybe that will be like a more accurate depiction of the time. But the downside to that is it makes kind of radical ideas or reinventions more difficult.
I think it's yet to be seen.
Well, yeah, well, true.
As is most of the book. So to turn a little bit, you alluded to the Constitution and how difficult it is to change, and obviously in this political climate, we were talking before, and you said you got a lot of things right, before this election happened. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, and then specifically, you talk in the book about the hedgehog and the fox, and the fox knows many things, and the hedgehog only knows one thing, and I'm wondering if that's Hillary and Donald Trump.
Well, okay, first of all, I don't know if I got a lot of things right, but I did get lucky in that I would not have anticipated that people would be concerned about the eye of democracy so quickly. Like, I was thinking this is something that would happen in 100 years, not like a few months. Because when I was writing that book, even when I was touring, I toured from the book in the summer, and like, I'm guessing a lot of people, I was absolutely certain Clinton was going to win. I thought Clinton was going to win at 7:15 p.m. on election night. I was watching the returns, and I was like, boy, he doesn't seem to be affecting the Congress races that much. What does that mean? Like, I thought he would, but then, just kind of building. But that's a different thing. That's like being wrong about the immediate future, Yeah. It does, I think, it's like dangerous ideas to even talk about. Sort of, it's like, is there a social downside to the things that we think are great, like allowing every person to vote? Does that sort of put people? Does it then put your society basically at risk of being controlled by theoretically the lowest sort of intellectual level? I mean, but you're not supposed to think this, because it's like everything about democracy is supposed to be great. People who love the internet talk about how it like democratizes communication, and you can't really argue with them because they say it democratizes communication. Of course, if I went around saying like we should democratize uranium and we should all have weapons grade uranium, people would be like, that doesn't seem so great. But it's the same thing. It's like, just because you use the word democracy doesn't make something genius. It just means that it's shared, and you're sharing it with people who might not necessarily know what to do with it. I mean, you can't. There's some things that you can't say. But it is, to me, amazing. It's like, okay, to become a citizen of this country, you have to take a citizenship test, and in all likelihood, English is your second language, but you got to pass this test. But if you're born here, you can just vote. You don't even know anything about how it works. It doesn't matter. It's like, that seems illogical to me, but that's just the structure. Now, as far as like the hedgehog, fox stuff, this is the idea of like this old Russian or Greek proverb. It's like, it's like the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. Okay? And what you're saying is like this, does this seem to fit Hillary and Trump? Well, it does in a way. But the question becomes like, what is the one big thing Trump knows?
Any ideas?
Well, I don't know. It really depends on what your your worldview. I mean, the example I use in the book was Reagan. Okay, and the thing that Reagan knew, he's kind of the ultimate hedgehog, was that if people feel good about where they live, it doesn't matter what's going on. That if you give people an optimism about how they feel about their life, it doesn't really matter what the conditions you put them in. If you make them believe that their life can improve, that's all they need. It doesn't actually have to improve, just the dream that it could. I don't know, though, if you could say that Trump is following that template, because he is mostly saying the country is bad. That's what he is most.
Yeah, maybe
Yes,
that's his one thing.
Well, that people, and if it is, it's that there is a large percentage of the country who believe the country is bad, that there is something very wrong with this country, and they can't even really. They don't even want to specifically say what it is. They don't even. They either consciously want to fight the urge to say. They don't know. That might be the one thing he would understand. I mean, if you look at Hillary's campaign, though. I mean, it's a complicated thing. Like, she seemed like the most qualified, to me, person ever to run for the presidency. I think she would have been a very, very good president, and I wish she would have won. That said, you know, she had a massive lead over Trump and lost it. In 2008, she had a massive advantage over Obama and lost. She was involved with Bill's campaign when he was an incumbent governor in Arkansas and lost. It does seem as though this one very important part of being a political person is her greatest weakness. Like, she's bad at campaigning. Like, she doesn't totally understand. I shouldn't say she doesn't totally understand. She's smarter than I am. But I'm saying that there's something about that she struggles in this really sort of integral part of being a public person. I mean, she became a senator, but in New York, where it's like if you run as a Democrat, you can't really lose. I don't know. I don't know if that answers the question.
No, that was good. I'm going to switch gears a little bit because everyone's probably sick of politics anyway. So one category that you don't discuss in the book is visual art. So you discuss authors and musicians, and I'm just curious, there's always a lot of discussion, especially because there's a market value to art, be that Picasso or Warhol. And if you have any thoughts about either from the 20th century or our current time period, how that will shape up in a similar way that you dissected sort of the other mediums.
Well, like, this isn't any brilliant insight, but it seems as though the art objects, the physical objects themselves, will become more valuable since there's no. Or will it be the opposite? Because there's a sense that you can see any art you want now immediately, but to see the actual thing, you have to be there. But that was always the case. How will it affect? I guess I don't know.
So what is it going to be like? You talk about the Beatles being an obvious choice. Is Warhol sort of a similar thing where you think there's going to be sort of other people that come up?
Well, part of it has to do with the idea that, like, and this is kind of an aphorism, but I think there's real truth in it. It's like, history is ultimately defined by people who don't know what they're defining. It's you talk to somebody who's an expert in any field, and you say, like, who is the most important person in this field? They might have a whole, myriad possibilities. They will be like, well, it could be this person, it could be this, But if you ask the average person, like with John Philip Sousa, who doesn't know as much, they'll just say the answer that seems obvious, and therefore that person kind of becomes, it's almost like all the other candidates fall by the wayside, and then there's one that remains, and that one remaining candidate gets amplified. So like somebody like Andy Warhol, his name has sort of, kind of like Kafka, has moved into this different thing where people who don't really know anything about his life or even could say, like, well, this is the kind of thing he did, they know what it means in a way. They know that it means like a, even if they don't have like the language to describe it, it's like a populist kind of art that moves away from sort of the virtuosity of the creator and is just idea-based and all of these things. So it does seem like, yes, that he could become shorthand for what visual art for the whole last half of the 20th century was. That seems very possible.
Yeah. So if you were able to single-handedly determine in the future what would be remembered in terms of both music and books, and there wasn't this whole system, but you, Chuck, could say, this is the book that I think is defining, it could be your book, is defining for generations to come. It could be Kiss because that's your favorite band. What would you leave the future with if you could determine what should represent now?
Well, I think like a lot of people, what I would like to do is assume that merit is the thing that matters in this thing, which isn't the case in reality. But it would be nice, if somebody said, like we're talking about rock music, if there should be one artist that represents all of it, in a rational world, the answer should be the Beatles. But the world is not rational. So I don't know. I would pick the Beatles right now. I would say that's who it should be. But I guess I have more confidence in the possibility that I will be wrong than I do in the confidence I have in the Beatles' greatness, in a way.
Yeah.
It's just that the history of ideas tells us we will be wrong. And I understand your question, but I guess in a sense I wouldn't want that responsibility. I mean, I really wouldn't. I've spent most of my career as a critic, music critic. I was a film critic for a while. But I think what probably makes me slightly different than most critics, and you could argue this makes me better at it or worse, but I have no interest in taste-making or dictating public consensus. I never have written about anything, and I was like, I want people to agree with this. As you mentioned, I love Kiss, okay? The Beatles are the greatest band. Kiss is my favorite band, okay? I've written a ton about Kiss, but never with the intention that somebody would be like, "Now, you know what? He's right. Kiss is good." I don't care. I have no interest in that. I just sort of like writing about sort of my experience with things and sort of how I think thinking about something can be as enriching as experiencing it. I was always that way. When I grew up in the 80s, right? I listened to hair metal all the time. Okay? And, all my friends did too. But what was different about me, I realized later in life, is I didn't just want to listen to Motley Crue. I wanted to talk about it and think about it and why are they doing this? And what does this mean? And none of my friends did. They were like, it rocks. Shut up, basically, That's just how I am. That's just the kind of person I am. So when I have no desire to sort of shape the way that the world is. I just kind of want to live in the world and make a living sort of working through, kind of living inside my mind.
So you're going to leave it up to chance then?
Yes.
I was giving you a chance.
I'll leave it up to chance. Yeah.
Figure out the future for us.
Chance is more qualified.
Chance is more qualified. So back to the meritocracy issue, because I do think that you discuss that in your book, that merit is a component here, that it's not just all sort of chance.
Merit gets you into the conversation.
It gets you into the conversation. Yeah. So in terms of that, obviously there's a couple promotion mechanisms. There's managers and promotion themselves, there's the critics, and there's the internet. And sort of, has the internet helped us democratize and make content more of based on merit? Has the internet sort of helped, bubble up things that should bubble up, or has it just created a long tail of stuff?
Well, I do think to some degree it has improved television. I think that there was not a lot of serious criticism about television prior to the internet, and it sort of raised the stakes of what television should or could be. I haven't seen that happen, though, in film or music, or literature, certainly. I guess, the thing is, the idea of merit is that it can come from all of those sources. In the 70s or whatever, Led Zeppelin got terrible reviews, but people loved them. They were the most important band from that period. Eventually, we get to the late 80s, a lot of the people who listened to Led Zeppelin in the 70s are now critics. Led Zeppelin is re-examined and removed. Now they're the third most important band of all time or whatever. That wasn't the critical response to their work, but sort of the populist response to the work, and eventually that changed. There are other artists, like Velvet Underground or whatever, where it was they were sort of almost invented the idea of a critic's band. And then if not for critics to kind of move this music along slowly, always introducing it to the new class of kind of smart art kids, that would have been lost because it didn't succeed. Now the internet's a different thing now. The internet works, it's much greater magnitude. And yet, in many ways, seems to sort of have the same effect on things, but actually maybe a much bigger effect than the way, say, things like MTV was described in the 80s. It seems like that if the internet makes someone famous or makes something famous, there's this sort of built-in finite lifespan. Because the internet's always going to be new. I mean, that's what sort of, I think, in many ways, what people love about it is, you know, in the 90s, for example, when email was new, you know, you'd click on your email to see if you got any new messages. Sometimes you did, and very often you didn't. Then you'd go back to work, and you'd go and check it again, maybe something. You'd have to check, and you'd hope somebody, you know. But Twitter's not like that. Twitter's always changing. If you want a distraction, it's always different, you know. That's a built-in component to what the internet's supposed to represent, the idea that it's constantly building itself and rechurning itself. But that shortens the possibility of how long something can... It'll be interesting to see if you know, like if there's like a Rebecca Black who's famous for 5 years. Like, I don't know if that can happen, you know.
You've got people like Bieber, right, who come up through this.
But I mean, he sells conventional records. He goes to shows. You know, I mean, she was somebody who was like really an internet thing. There are some things that are internet
things
that is almost the totality of their experience. You know, I mean, I'm sure somebody in this room probably had a shirt 10 years ago that said like "I'm internet famous" or whatever. I remember when that phrase was like something a lot of people in the blogging community liked to throw around and wear, you know. But that was a funny thing. It was like saying I'm internet famous at the time was like a shirt saying I'm not famous. Like it meant the same thing. To say that meant the opposite, you know. Yeah.
Cool. I'm going to invite the audience up for questions now. So if you want to come up to
that dude's been waiting for a while, I think.
Yes. So, dude who's been waiting for a while.
Poor timing for a mediocre question. So I think a lot of people probably had a conversation with their friends sometimes about, you know, what power would you rather have in flying and et cetera. But Visible Man ruined that for me because it made me concerned that the ability to do anything that may be beyond what we're normally able to do would generate or exacerbate some latent psychosis or other.
Yeah, well, it's like the plot of Westworld, basically.
Right.
Like Westworld's really. I mean, I love this show, but like it is kind of interesting. They're like, you know what? If we build a utopia, you know what's the first thing everyone want to do? Rape. That would be the first thing. Like, I'm surprised somebody hasn't written an idea that like Westworld. The creators of Westworld are basically saying like, this proves that rape culture is real. That if you could rape robots, you'd do it instantly, like 10 minutes after you got there. But anyways, finish your question.
Would I guess I'm just kind of curious about your process in writing that book, because did it start with your great ability to kind of write about people and sort of speculate what they would do when they're alone, or was that a device or were you studying more the people alone, or is it the person who is able to view them, or both?
Oh, well, thank you for reading that novel, first of all. Not many people did, so I appreciate that. I mean, that book is based around a couple things. One, it's based around the idea, to me, of journalism, and the idea that, you know, I'd spent my life interviewing people, but always feeling as though somehow, even though this is the best means to understand somebody, it's still not successful. It's like there's just no way to understand other people except to ask them to, you know. But simply by asking the question, you're sort of changing how they're going to respond. And I was like, if I could see these people when no one else is around, then I could really understand what they are actually like. And then I thought to myself, am I that way? Am I really only comfortable when I'm by myself? Like, is that the only, like in every other situation, even with the people I'm closest to, my wife, you know, it's like, am I unconsciously editing my behavior? I have a kid who's almost 3 now. When I'm around him, I feel that I almost feel like I'm by myself in some ways, in terms of comfort. And it makes me wonder if, this the first time I'm around someone that I'm not editing myself at all. So that was the initial idea. And then the other idea is that, okay, in a previous book, I had written about time travel. So I had to reread H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. Okay, so I ordered it on Amazon. I was living in Germany for some reason at the time. Well, not because teaching there, that was the reason. But I was living in Germany, and I ordered this book, but it's now packaged with The Invisible Man. So it's 2 H.G. Wells books. So I read The Time Machine, and then I said, like, I'm going to reread The Invisible Man, which I had read, of course, when I was young. And the thing that I found really intriguing, reading it as an adult, is that the Invisible Man is a fucking jerk in that book. He's just a total asshole the whole book, and I thought, like, that's hilarious. Somehow when I'd read the book, I was into the idea of, like, just, the invisibility, invisible, and potions, and so, I was like, it's just kind of funny to do a character study. The kind of person who would want to be invisible would have to be a jerk.
Thank you.
Hey, so the title of your book is called But What If We're Wrong? In the past hour, I think it's become pretty clear that we probably are wrong. So where do we go from this point?
Well, here's the deal. You can't change. You can't say like I'm giving up, right? You can't be like I'm not going to try to figure out any things that might be wrong. That'd be kind of like saying like, this isn't my joke, but it'd be kind of like Mitch Hedberg. Do you remember who Mitch Hedberg? He was sort of like people would say like he loved to drink red wine. And people would be like, why do you drink red wine? It's going to give you a hangover. And he's like, well, yeah, at the end, the beginning and middle are great. It's like, I'm not going to not eat an apple because it has a core, It's like, so you got to keep going, right? Like, you might be wrong in the end, but you still got to try. The thing is, people will ask me about this book, like, is it optimistic or is it pessimistic? Like, is it optimistic to be like, oh, it's humbling and kind of amazing that our sense of reality might be false. It's amazing. Or is it pessimistic, like, we're doomed, it's hopeless, whatever. I really feel like it's neutral. Like, the world's going to change, okay? Some things you might be right about. Most things you're going to be wrong about. It's going to feel weird, but mostly it's going to feel different. The reason, a lot of times, as you grow older, that the world seems worse is not because the world has gotten worse, and it's not because the world's gotten better but excluded you. It just got different, and you were comfortable with what you had. Like, the example I use on this sometimes is like, okay, when I was growing up, for the longest time in my life, I had 6 cassettes. And I had to play these 6 cassettes over and over and over again. I would read the liner notes. And I had this deep experience with them. Well, now a kid in 8th grade has access to hundreds and thousands of songs, okay? So they can have sort of a shallow experience with this whole world of music. They would look back on my experience and be like, that was terrible to only have 6 cassettes. I look at theirs and go like, they're really missing something. And all it is different. They're both the same,
Cool.
So in your book, you're talking about how every generation has something they think is the truth, and then later on, at some point in the future, either it turns out to be wrong or just not totally right. If you had right now instantly unlimited resources, what would you do to change that cycle? If you have something in mind to change that cycle.
Well, that's a very
like
great.
You have trillions of
No,
dollars.
that's a real interesting question, because you're sort of unconsciously saying the fact that we're going to be wrong is bad. And I don't know if that's true.
No.
Because it might be that you need to be wrong about things to realize what you were wrong about in order to make better guesses later. Like, what would I change if I could change anything about the reality to make us more right?
No, I don't want to use the word more right.
Yeah.
But there's a cycle. It's the same cycle that's happening again. We always think, this is the truth. So I was just thinking when I was reading your book.
It might, we might be just talking about human nature.
Maybe.
Because I was talking to somebody recently about generations. There's the millennials, and Generation Y, and Generation X, and the baby boomers, and the greatest generation, and they all have different. All those generations have these wildly different perceptions. But the only thing that is unifying is that every generation, when looking at the one prior, thinks that the people have not dealt with adversity and they don't work as hard. And every time they're right, because the world gets easier.
Yeah.
And they make it, now they'll say like, oh, millennials, they don't like to work hard, they're entitled. With Generation X, it was like, they don't like to work hard, they just want to drop out of society and sit in coffee shops, Like when baby boomers were in control, sort of, the greatest generation said like, we fought wars. They're like looking at Jane Fonda and going to, it's like everyone always thinks that the generation that came after them, has less, has had less social friction and is therefore less committed. But that is a true thing. That is true for every generation, And it will be forever. And the wrongness that is sort of inherent might be just part of what it means to be alive.
Yeah.
That you're going to look at something, you're going to think what it means, and later someone else will say like, no, you looked at it wrong.
Yeah. Agree.
Jamie?
Hey, thanks so much for being here.
pleasure.
When I was in high school, actually, my favorite band was the Beatles, and my second was Kiss, so I'm right there with you.
You're a genius, yeah.
So my question is, a couple times today you've talked about the second half of the 20th century and like sort of what characterizes it. But I feel like when we look at history, that's not really how we think about it. Like, for instance, like with that level of granularity, you know, like when I think about history, I'm like, okay, there was a chunk from like 1000 AD to like 1400 AD, and like that was like one history, right?
Yeah.
So do you think history is in like a sense like speeding up now, or is it just that every generation has thought that, and like, you know, in 1,000 years people will be like, in 17 or in 1800, like the United States was formed and this was its culture, you know?
Well, no, yeah. I mean, what you're saying is there's a little of this in this book actually where we discuss this. Like, okay, when we look at the 1800s now, like we look at it basically like there was the early 1800s, there was the Civil War, and there was the Reconstruction, like basically in 3 parts. Okay, as we get further away from that, it'll probably just be the Civil War. You know, I mean, this granular thing you're talking about, that of course, you know, we talk about the 70s in a way, the way that like we talk about history from the 1670s in a sense, but it's not going to really work that way in real terms. As we get further and further away, the 20th century becomes, I mean, the reason that I kind of break it in these 2 halves is because there was something that pretty dramatic happened in the United States, well, many things in the 20th century, but after World War II, there was the invention of the teenager, which was this meaningful thing that prior to World War II, you were a kid and then you were an adult. Whenever you got married or when you started working, and they could happen when you were 12, basically, you became an adult. And then after World War II, there was this idea that there was this middle space between these 2 things. And the advent of the car played a role. The advent of television and rock music played a huge role in this. And that really changed the way society operated, this idea, you know. So that's sort of what the split I see. Now, as we get further away from this, the 20th century might be seen just sort of in totality. And when someone talks about the greatest rock musician, like I was saying, they might actually say, well, it's Frank Sinatra. Like he might be seen as, you know, they might sort of combine everything into this one mass. That will happen. You're right. I mean, obviously it'd be weird if we were like, let's talk about the history of 1394. Like that would be a very difficult thing. Although it will be possible to do that to 1984. There will be enough sort of leftover shit to go through and say, like, we can really look at this one year. We can't do that, you know, or the Dark Ages or whatever. They're dark. We don't even know, you know, it's like we don't know anything about huge swaths of time. We have no idea what was going on. Like Charlemagne was around, man.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I hope this isn't weird for you to hear, but I grew up reading you in Spin, so very excited to be talking to you.
I'm old. Yeah. I like being old.
One of my favorite reflections, like on music in general, was "Shut Up and Play the Hits."
Okay.
Of the Last Waltz, I felt like "Shut Up and Play the Hits" was very much in the spirit of that. You obviously played a big part in that. Like speaking of sort of going back and thinking about things differently, do you feel differently about the interviews with James and the conversation and the meaning of the conversation now, given that the breakup wasn't exactly forever, kind of? And just, you know, offhand, what are the bands that you feel like today are sort of carrying on the spirit that LCD Sound System once had?
Well, okay, he's asked me about this documentary. I was in this documentary for LCD Sound System, and it was about the end of the band. I had interviewed James Murphy, the lead singer of LCD Sound System, for The Guardian, okay? We had a great interview. This is a few years before. The guys making this film, they say to me, it's like, hey, we want you to interview him again, and we're going to show the concert, and there's going to be these interstitial things where you're interviewing him, so we'd like you to interview him again. So they set me up to do this, and I'm like, I'll do it. I didn't realize that they literally wanted me to do the exact same interview. Like, they wanted me to ask the exact same questions, and I was like, I don't remember what they were or whatever. So in the movie, I am literally playing myself, pretending to be me, and I'm very bad at it. Okay. Do I feel different about it that the band did not even stay broken up for, 5 years? They didn't even make it 5 years? 4 years, I think? A little bit. I mean, I feel kind of dumb. I have a hard time imagining that he really believed they were never going to reunite if it happened that quickly. But that said, it was like, they said, come here, we'll pay you $5,000 to do this. We're not making any promises. I did it. I can't complain. It's like I didn't, it's like I can't complain that the guy wants to keep making music for a band that's good. What am I supposed to be? It's like I was in your movie, don't reform. What bands now do I feel like that have to have the impact of LCD Sound System? That impact's not that great in a way. I mean, it's like it was their last show could be at Madison Square Garden. That's the only time they could have ever done this. Now I guess they played Coachella. I guess it's similar. It's a weird thing. I talk about in this book about how I kind of think that rock music is not going to be dead, but it's really disappearing from the culture. And I mean, I know other people have said that in the past. People started saying rock is dead in 1969. But here's why it's different. Like the time that people felt rock music was the most under assault, the most dangerous time was disco, okay? Disco starts in 1975. In 1979, there's this thing, Disco Demolition Night in Chicago, where at a baseball game, they blew up disco records. And there was a huge riot. Because it was also like nickel beer that night. It was a very strange... They had a bad idea of like how to combine promotions, but anyways, okay. So that's like less than 5 years. Okay, and this is the time when people were like so worried about what would happen to rock music. Okay, within that time span, when rock was under assault or whatever, Fleetwood Mac Rumors came out, the first Van Halen record came out, all the punk things happened. A lot of the big Eagles records came out. Many albums that are now perceived as being canonical important things. Okay. Well, how long has it been since there's been a canonical, important rock record? Like you could say In Rainbows, maybe, but that was for the way it was released. It's the probably third or fourth best Radiohead record. I mean, you can go back to The Strokes. That music wasn't that popular. Like, there are many people now who are into music who have no memory of a rock record ever being big. And I don't know if there's ever going to be ones again. So you say what bands? It's like none.
All right, that's a little sad, but...
I think we probably have time for one more question.
Awesome.
Unfortunately.
So in the last month, like fake news...
Well, are we literally out of time? Or can I tell you? These guys have been waiting. I'll take it. I'll be quick.
Okay.
I'll be quick.
Okay, cool. So fake news, broad topic. The narrative around it is kind of that it's like a new thing. My thought is that it's been around forever, just in a different form. How do you think that this cycle was more impacted by fake news than perhaps other
Okay,
things?
was it more impacted? Probably, but here's my thing on fake news. Okay, I saw all these stories where it was like fake news beat real news, okay? What they mean by beat is how often it was looked at. Well, I looked at all those stories too. I didn't believe them. I think a normal, I shouldn't say a normal, I think somebody who's involved with the internet and the media, it's like, if you see a story that's like the Pope endorses Trump and you don't see it anywhere else, that makes me think that probably wasn't true, okay? So I think that these stories, these fake news stories, were read and consumed like crazy. I don't know how much impact they had, and if they did, the impact they had was on people who I think were probably not going to be the most critical thinkers about the election anyways. Like if they're that easily impacted, I don't know if real news would have helped, So I think that it probably had an impact, some impact, but like it didn't cost Hillary the election. No.
Thanks. So you were the high point of the ethicist.
Thank you.
Your departure. So I wanted to
Not
try
many
to
people think that.
two-part ethicist question.
Okay.
So one is the ethics of using, say, incognito mode to look at the New York Times without a subscription, kind of poking through the paywall. And two, does engaging with the ethicist, either ethicist emeritus or the real ethicist, create a sort of ethical contract for the asker to then follow the ethicist's instructions?
Well, first of all, to answer the first part, I mean, the fact that you're asking the question means that you definitely understand that is theft. Okay? Like the fact that technology allows it to happen doesn't change it. I remember this was with file sharing. It was like people were like, well, file sharing is different than shoplifting because it's like nothing's being removed or whatever. And it was like, well, yeah, but if there'd been a machine that allowed you to mentally go into Target and take out a record and it would still be there, but you'd have it, and now you don't get to buy it, it's still stealing. It's like I'm not like I downloaded tons of shit, but I was stealing it. I stole it. Okay? And so if you're looking at the Times and not paying for it, for the Times to exist, they have to pay reporters, they got to pay editors, they got to pay all that infrastructure. It's like you're not paying for it. You're stealing it. That's life, though. That's how it is. It's the reality we live in, and they're going to have to figure out a way to get around that. Whether or not you have to take my advice, well, are you saying that if you decide you like the ethicist, you got to believe him? Maybe you just think I'm interesting.
Oh, you're definitely interesting. I just meant like, does the act
But I
of
mean, yeah,
engaging
but
with an
wrong. Like,
ethical
what I'm saying is, you
counselor
might
kind of,
what?
Does the act of like engaging with an ethical counselor sort of imply a certain contract or?
Well, no. I think it suggests you're curious about something and you want a second opinion. You know, I don't think that would ever be the case. Like when I did the ethicist, my thing was people were asking me a question, and I would think about it for might sit in my email box for 3 weeks, and then I answer it and think about it for a week and write it. Then it takes like 10 days for the magazine to come out. The problem was already gone for that person. My thing was, can I use a problem that other people could apply to other things in their life? So here, kind of like how I don't care about tastemaking. Like I never thought like, I'm giving you this advice because you got to do this or you're unethical. Mine's like, my ethical sort of framework tells me that this would be the right answer. I'm not even sure if I'd do it if I was you, but this is the ethical answer. It's like when somebody asks you like a problematic question, that there's something in their life that they want to do, and you know it's bad, but you know if you were in that situation, you'd do it. You still say, well, this is bad. Granted, I might do the same, but it's bad. Like what I'm saying is I'm a hypocrite. Okay, it's like.
So in today's climate of this diversity of opinions and misinformation, and also the pursuit of intellectual truth, what are your views on Google's kind of special role and responsibility in that?
Well, it seems as though that they have a very difficult question. That they're either going to say, like, we're going to just be the mechanism, and we're going to allow people, basically, to police themselves, or we are going to guide them, and we are going to say that certain things we deem as socially detrimental, that are an extension of our platform, and we need to make adjustments to stop that from happening. It's a little bit like your office, okay? That second thing I described is kind of like how nice your office seems when I walk through it. Like, this is definitely better than the rest of the world. And yet the thing I described is, once again, how the dystopic novel starts. This idea that some institution is like, well, we're going to decide and we're going to take the responsibility over how people should live. So I don't know. I don't know what the better answer is. I think that in the short term, it is probably better for them to step in and sort of shape how Google operates and how people use it. In the long term, probably freedom is better, transparency is better. I don't know. It's a very good question. I'm sure this is something you guys talk about here sometimes. Like you can't talk about it constantly, but you must go out for drinks or whatever, and you start talking about your life, and you're like, what are, Because when I said, I compared you to like NASA and something, I mean, I'm serious about that. I mean, the things that you're doing now are not just sort of changing the way the world operates, but there are people like my kids growing up who are going to grow up thinking of Google the way I think of a hammer or a fork. That there are just these things that exist that I use, and the idea that they have any sort of meaning will be lost to them because you can't see meaning in something that is just there, So it's a good question. Not for me, though. Somebody smarter. Yeah.
Cool. Well, that brings us full circle. Please help me in thanking Chuck for being here today.